This is Hana Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Belagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory from Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 5, Modernity, Multiplicity, and Becoming. The 19th century marked a profound shift in the orientation of literature and criticism away from metaphysical absolutes and timeless ideals toward the disruptive forces of history and change. As industrialization, urbanization, and revolution accelerated across Europe, writers and philosophers were compelled to rethink the role of literature in a world shaped by flux and fragmentation. This chapter explores how major thinkers navigated the complexities of modernity, multiplicity, and becoming. Their work raises a central question: how does literature relate to historical context, and what role can it play in confronting or articulating the crises of modern life? For Karl Marx, modernity is inseparable from capitalism, which he describes as a dynamic yet destructive force that simultaneously liberates and alienates. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels famously declare that capitalism melts all that is solid into air, underscoring its relentless capacity to dissolve traditional institutions and values. The bourgeoisie, while revolutionary in its origin, becomes parasitic and self-defeating, failing to safeguard the very working class upon which it depends. Engels' observations in Manchester reinforced this critique, exposing the brutal, dehumanizing conditions faced by industrial laborers. History, for Marx, is not the unfolding of divine purpose, but a dialectical conflict between opposing material forces, culminating in revolutionary transformation. Literature in this context becomes a site not only for reflection, but of resistance, capable of revealing ideology and imagining alternatives. George Eliot's realism represents an ethical intervention in the cultural and psychological disorientation of modernity, seeking to bridge the gap between sympathy and truth. In Adam Bede, Eliot identifies 5 interconnected principles to realistic narrative: close observation, moral complexity, character inconsistency, linguistic uncertainty, and inclusiveness towards marginalized life. Through her depiction of Adam, Dinah, and Hetty, Eliot demonstrates how well-intentioned individuals often mislead each other, caught within their own biases and social limitations. Eliot casts the novelist as a witness in a courtroom, bearing the burden of conveying life honestly while recognizing the fallibility of perception. This mirror metaphor, central to her aesthetics, acknowledges that no reflection is perfect, especially when fractured by class, gender, or ideological division. Her language embraces figurative richness and polysemy, resisting reductive binaries and celebrating nuance. Eliot's commitment to representing the ordinary, craftspeople, laborers, dependent women, is itself a political and ethical stance. By insisting that every life deserves narrative attention and complexity, she elevates fiction into a practice of moral engagement. Eliot's realism is as much formal as thematic, offering a layered narrative voice that mediates conflicting perspectives without erasing their tensions. Her omniscient narrator is not neutral, but effectively involved, blending moral insight into social analysis to shape the reader's judgment. In Adam Bede, Dinah's religious idealism, Mrs. Poyser's earthly pragmatism, and Adam's earnest labor ethic represent divergent worldviews brought into dialogic exchange. Unlike Dickens, whose social vision leans on caricature and satire, Eliot embraces complexity, psychological realism, and ethical ambiguity. Her work extends romantic sympathy, but grounds it in contemporary debates on sociology and evolution, particularly on the writings of Auguste Comte and Charles Darwin. The influence of scientific discourse strengthens her portrayal of environment and heredity, reinforcing the historical embeddedness of her characters' actions. Eliot's sympathy is not sentimental, but informed by intellectual seriousness, grounded in the conditions of 19th century rural and provincial life. Her nuanced exploration of marginalized cultures, like Methodism or regional dialects, prefigures post-colonial concerns with linguistic and cultural subordination. Through her fiction, Eliot offers a compelling model of how literature can synthesize moral reflection and historical consciousness. While Eliot aims to reform society through sympathetic realism, Marx insists that such reform is insufficient in the face of capitalist structural violence. His adaptation of Hegelian dialectics replaces spiritual progression with material conflict, arguing that historical change is driven by class antagonism. Alienated labor lies at the heart of his critique. Under capitalism, workers become estranged from the products they create, from one another, and from their own humanity. In Capital, Marx reveals how commodities acquire a fetishized autonomy while workers are reduced to tools of production. Redemption lies not in reform, but in unalienated labor, a future in which productive activity is freely chosen and socially meaningful. For Marx, the aesthetic values celebrated by figures like Pater or Wilde are inaccessible to most people until capitalism itself is overturned. Only through revolution can the material conditions of beauty, autonomy, and self-expression be universally realized. Charles Baudelaire offers a striking different account of modernity, rooted not in economic analysis, but in sensory experience, artistic detachment, and poetic renewal. In The Painter of Modern Life, he introduces the flâneur as a new figure for the modernist artist, wandering the boulevards, absorbing the ethereal rhythms of the city. For Baudelaire, modernity consists of capturing the transient, the fleeting, and the contingent, then transforming it into something eternal through style. In the prose poem Loss of a Halo, the poet, once idealized and elevated, willingly descends into the streets, exchanging transcendence for participation. Baudelaire rejects both romantic idealism and Platonic purity, choosing instead the grime, noise, and dislocation of Haussmann's Paris. His aesthetic turns shock, disorientation, fragmentation into poetic materials, crafting a sensibility suited to the modern condition. Walter Benjamin emphasizes the crowd as a site of this transformation, the place where the poet confronts the anonymous multitude and finds new forms of lyricism. Baudelaire's work thus signals a break from the sacred and the pastoral towards an urban poetics of sensation, simultaneity, and loss. In his hands, literature becomes a mirror of the modern soul, fractured, alert, and actually aware of its historical moment. In contrast to Baudelaire's embrace of this array, Matthew Arnold turns to literature and criticism as sources of order, coherence, and ethical uplift. In Culture and Anarchy, he laments the moral and cultural fragmentation of Victorian society, identifying a lack of shared values among classes. Arnold proposes culture, defined as the pursuit of sweetness and light, as the solution to this social disintegration. He distinguishes between Hebraism, moral strictness, and Hellenism, intellectual flexibility, favoring the latter as a path towards harmonious development. Criticism, modeled on Socratic questioning, should challenge unexamined beliefs and foster disinterested reflection. Yet Arnold's ideal of the best self, grounded in a fixed canon, struggles to accommodate the diversity and instability that characterize modern life. His faith in unity, while noble, now appears nostalgic, an attempt to reclaim stability in a world already shaped by multiplicity. Friedrich Nietzsche takes Arnold's anxiety about disorder and pushes it into a celebration of contradiction, fluidity, and the dissolution of the absolutes. His infamous statement, God is dead, declares the end of metaphysical certainty and the beginning of radical individual responsibility. For Nietzsche, truth is no longer something to be discovered, but something created, a product of power, style, and affect. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he dismantles traditional ethics, tracing their origins to resentment, repression, and historical violence. Genealogy replaces linear history with discontinuity, emphasizing rupture, appropriation, and interpretation as the engines of change. The self, too, is not unified but multiple, constructed from competing drives, masks, and aesthetic choices. Nietzsche dismisses historical objectivity as a cowardly denial of interpretation, describing objective historians as castrated voyeurs of history. His theory of perspectivism calls for a multiplication of viewpoints, not to reach consensus, but to embrace complexity. In literature, this ethos gives rise to irony, fragmentation, and formal innovation, where the text resists closure. Nietzsche's influence on post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida and Foucault affirms his centrality to modern critiques of meaning and authorship. Walter Pater builds on the aesthetic shift heralded by Baudelaire and Nietzsche, but directs it inward, crafting a vision of literature as a heightened mode of sensation and refined perception. In his conclusion to the Renaissance, he evokes Heraclitus to describe existence as a flickering flame, unstable, devouring, and vivid, insisting that our only possession is the moment. Pater exhorts readers not to pursue truth or moral progress, but to cultivate the richest possible experience of life through art, beauty, and consciousness. The critic's task, as Pater defines it, is not to judge or instruct, but to respond with precision to the shifting impressions of inner and outer worlds. His aestheticism caused unease among Victorian readers, especially for its rejection of duty and utility in favor of cultivated pleasure and ephemeral intensity. Yet Pater's stress on self-reflexibility, stylistic elegance, and aesthetic form laid the groundwork for literary modernism, especially in its focus on subjectivity and fragmentation. Though discreet in tone, his philosophy of life as art resonated deeply with figures like Wilde and Virginia Woolf, who translated it into more public, performative idioms. In Pater, we find a turning point. Literature ceases to moralize and begins to shimmer with ambiguity, affect, and elusive depth. Oscar Wilde, drawing on Pater's aesthetic inwardness and Nietzsche's challenge to fixed values, envisions criticism as the supreme artist form, imaginative, introspective, and generative. In The Critic as Artist, Wilde stages a Platonic dialogue that both honors and undermines its philosophical lineage, turning criticism into performance. He rejects the notion that art should imitate reality or convey moral truth. Instead, it should provoke, suggest, and evoke moods not reducible to fixed meaning. Wilde declares that to know the truth, one must imagine myriads of falsehoods, embracing the instability of language and the multiplicity of interpretation. The critic, rather than uncovering an artist's intent, bestows meaning upon the work, making reading itself a form of creation. This vision anticipates Barthes's theory of the death of the author, placing the interpretive act in the hands of the reader. For Wilde, both literature and criticism are subjective, performative acts, games of style, wit, and mood that resist authority and certainty. His embrace of intertextuality and suggestion over direct statement aligns with later modernist and postmodernist strategies, from T.S. Eliot to Roland Barthes. Wilde ultimately positions literature as a realm of becoming, where fixed identities, moral imperatives, and singular meanings dissolve into the play of interpretation and form. Wilde's idea of literature as becoming, not being, anticipates the experimental forms and aesthetic sensibilities of modernism and postmodernism. He envisions a future where literature no longer conveys fixed messages, but invites ambiguity, reflection, and shifting modes. Form, for Wilde, precedes content. True art arises from its structural choices and internal logic rather than from any predetermined message. He champions suggestion over direct representation, arguing that the most powerful works of art evoke rather than declare meaning. In this vision, literature becomes introspective, intertextual, and always self-aware, resisting final interpretation. Wilde's call for introspective experimentation aligns literature with critical theory, erasing the line between aesthetic creation and reflective critique. Intertextuality becomes central. Meaning is no longer derived from raw experience, but from how prior texts are reworked and reimagined. Wilde's influence would echo through modernist interiority, postmodern fragmentation, and the ongoing redefinition of what literature can be. Stephen Mallarmé, writing at the end of the 19th century, takes Wilde's aestheticism further by dissolving not just meaning, but the very authorial presence that guarantees it. In Crise de Ver, Mallarmé argues that literature is no longer mimetic or expressive, but a field of evocation and suggestion, where sound, silence, and spacing constitute its true material. The poem becomes autonomous, severed from both external reference and the intentions of its creator. His vision foreshadows the concerns of post-structuralist thinkers like Jacques Derrida, who read Mallarmé as the precursor of deconstruction. Derrida identifies in Mallarmé the collapse of origin and finality. Texts no longer refer outward, but circulate endlessly among themselves. The signifier in Mallarmé's poetry does not stabilize into meaning, but dances across deferrals, disruptions, and dissonances. Literature thus becomes not a mirror of life or a reflection of the self, but a process of endless interpretation where closure is always postponed. Mallarmé's language performs what it cannot name. It gestures, fragments, and undermines the reader's quest for clarity. Derrida expands on this by introducing the concept of différance, a perpetual delay of meaning where the play of signs replaces fixed identity. In both thinkers, we encounter literature not as expression or doctrine, but as a self-reflexive activity that unsettles, defamiliarizes, and resists resolution. The chapter traces how modern literature and criticism turn from being to becoming, from unity to multiplicity, and from moral didacticism to aesthetic exploration. Marx and Eliot respond to social upheaval through revolution and realism, while Baudelaire, Arnold, and Nietzsche reimagine modernity as conflict, fragmentation, and artistic awakening. Pater and Wilde embrace subjectivity and flux, redefining criticism as creation, while Mallarmé dissolves the author and the referent into a play of signifiers. Together, these thinkers mark the transition of modernism and anticipate postmodernism's focus on instability, suggestion, and the refusal of finality. In this world of literary becoming, meaning is not inherited or imposed. It is generated, fragmented, and always still arriving. Thank you for your attention.